الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Today inshallah we will continue with our series of the Quranic miracles. I want to highlight two ayat from the 5th juz of the Quran. This is Surah An-Nisa chapter 4 verses 49 and 124. But before I actually go into these ayat, I want to give a very simplified explanation of a theory that many of you may have actually heard of, called string theory. So the basic premise is that to understand the objects and the universe around us, we need to be able to break it down and simplify it into smaller components. So for example, you have this table here. If I were to cut this table in half and the half that's remaining, cut that into half and then keep doing that for as long as I can do it, eventually I would end up with a piece of the table that's so small that our eyes can't even see it. And these, as we know, are molecules. So you can actually do the same process with molecules themselves, and you can break it down into further smaller parts, and what you end up with are atoms. So what scientists knew for a very long period of time was that atoms are the basic building blocks of everything that surrounds us. But we know that's not necessarily true today, because with the advent of modern scientific technology, we can actually break it down even further. So atoms actually consist of smaller particles such as electrons, protons, and neutrons. And these protons and neutrons are actually made up of even smaller particles such as quarks. And what scientists were trying to figure out for a very long time is, are these quarks actually made up of smaller particles? And these particles are actually so small that it was impossible for scientists to actually see if these particles even exist or not. So there was a theory that quarks are actually made up of smaller particles, and these are represented by single points in space. But this theory had a lot of different issues with it, in that physicists were not able to reconcile the phenomenon of gravity with quantum mechanics, so it was something that was very difficult and not able to be easily solved. So this is where string theory comes in. So string theory suggests that instead of quarks made up of smaller points, what if quarks were actually made up of strings? Instead of these small points, one-dimensional points, what if quarks were made up of actual strings? And these strings are vibrating with energy. So that actually solved a lot of the mathematical issues that physicists were encountering trying to reconcile quantum mechanics with gravity. So it's still a controversial theory. It's not proven yet, but it seems to make sense in that a lot of the mathematical equations work if we take the premise that the smallest particle that we can theorize that make up quarks are actually these strings that vibrate with a certain frequency of energy. So this vibration is actually very important, because the scientists theorized that these strings, if they vibrate at a certain frequency, they make up a different particle. For example, if you have a string that's vibrating at a certain energy, it becomes an electron. But if that same string vibrates at a different frequency of energy, that turns into a quark, for example. So that is the basic understanding of string theory. It is very, very difficult to understand if we go into the actual complexities of it. So I wanted to keep it very brief and very simplified. So with that basic understanding, I want to actually go into the verses now. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ألم تر إلى الذين يزكون أنفسهم بل الله يزكي من يشاء ولا يظلمون فتيلا. Have you not considered those who claim purity for themselves? Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purifies whom He wills, and they will not be wronged by a fatila. Now this word fatila is actually very interesting. So a common translation that you'll find in the tafsir and Quranic translations, online and in books, is fatila actually describes a small scaly thread that's found on a date stone, right? So we can actually take this a step further, that what the point that is trying to be made in this ayah is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purifies those whom He wills, and those people will not be harmed by even the smallest thing, right? That's what the message is trying to be portrayed in this ayah. وَلَا يُظْلَمُونَ فَتِيلًا. And the description, very interestingly enough, is something that is very stringish in nature, right? The scaly thread that you find on the date stone, that's what's actually being mentioned in this verse. Now, moving on to the next verse, this is verse number 124. It's a similar concept. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِنَ الصَّالِحَاتِ مِنْ ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى وَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ فَأُولَٰئِكَ يَدْخُلُونَ الْجَنَّةَ وَلَا يُظْلَمُونَ نَقِيرًا. That وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِنَ الصَّالِحَاتِ, whoever does righteous acts, whether male or female, مِنْ ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى وَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ, and he is a believer, فَأُولَٰئِكَ يَدْخُلُونَ الْجَنَّةَ, then they will enter paradise, وَلَا يُظْلَمُونَ نَقِيرًا, and they will not be wronged by naqira. And this is a very similar concept, meaning that they will not be wronged by the smallest thing. But the word is different. The previous word was fatila, and this one was naqira. So what does naqira actually mean? So in the common translations, you'll find naqira is actually a speck that you may find on a date stone, right? So it's a small speck. But the word naqara actually means to pluck. That's the actual trilingual meaning of it. So it's very interesting in that, when you think of plucking, you can also use that in the context of instrumentation. When you're playing instruments, you can pluck the strings of a violin, for example. And that when you pluck the strings of a violin, that actually generates some type of vibration, right? So if you put both of those verses together, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing that something that will not harm these people in the least, meaning they will not have even the smallest bit of harm. And the words that He used to describe such a small quantity is fatila, which can be represented by a string, and naqira, which can be represented by a type of vibration. And if you put these two together, this is a string that vibrates, and that exactly coincides with what is mentioned in the string theory. Now, this is not something that is scientifically proven. String theory is still controversial. Many scientists disagree with it as well and have other theories, but ultimately we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with His infinite wisdom, knows best. After all, He is the creator of the universes. And with that, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He continue to increase our understanding of the Quran and increase our understanding of the universe, and use it as a means for us to reflect and ponder upon the verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed for us. وآخر دعوانا عن الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.